What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
I am going to start with the sentence that has been replaying in my head since the moment this whole mess began, because it sums up the pattern, the disrespect, and the turning point all at once. And if you have ever had a sibling who knew exactly how to get away with things because the grown-ups would rather keep the peace than tell the truth, you will feel this in your bones. My brother borrowed my laptop without asking, kept it long enough that I knew something was off, then told me with a straight face that he had sold it for cash because he was in a tight spot, and when I reacted like any sane person would, he smirked and said that our parents would make me drop it like always. And the part that stung was that he was confident because history had taught him he could be. I told him the laptop was not a toy or a spare or some family communal device that could drift from room to room like a television remote. It was my work and my files and my life in one place, and he shrugged with that bored, practice look that says, "What are you going to do? Call Mom," because he already had the next act rehearsed, which was to spin a sad story about needing money for bills and promising to pay me back when things improved, as if a promise from him had ever been anything other than a way to kick responsibility down the road. When I called our parents, I did it the way you call people you love when you are trying to give them a chance to do the right thing before everything gets ugly, and I laid it out calmly that he had taken my laptop, sold it, and told me to let it go. And I wanted their help getting it back, or at least getting him to undo what he did. And there was this pause that I know too well, the pause that comes before the lecture about family loyalty and how we do not involve outsiders in family problems. And then came the familiar choreography where they minimize what happened, tell me that he is struggling, and suggest that I can buy a new one, and he will contribute when he is back on his feet, which is a sweet way of saying never. I said that this was not a broken mug or a missing sweater. This was years of saved drafts, tax documents, and private things that were mine to keep or delete, and my mother pivoted into the tone that has shut me down since I was a teenager. The tone that says I am being dramatic and harsh and that everyone is tired, and could we please not turn this into a federal case, while my father slipped into the management voice he used at work, the one that treats problems like spreadsheets where you trim the parts that make people uncomfortable and assign the loss to whoever will not explode, which has always been me. Mark, being Mark, called while they were still on speaker and said he would come by later with some cash as a gesture, not the full amount because, according to him, the store did not pay much, and the rest had already gone to cover something urgent. And I could hear the pride in his voice when he added that he had handled it like an adult, which I guess in his head means pawning your sister's property and waiting for Mom and Dad to sweep the shards into her lap. I will admit something that will make some people roll their eyes and others nod in recognition, which is that for a minute I felt the old gravity pulling me back toward the role I have always played. The reasonable one who swallows the insult, because keeping the family together is supposed to matter more than keeping my dignity intact. And I could already see the script for the weekend family dinner where everyone acts normal and I am supposed to laugh at his jokes because peace has been purchased with my silence again. That is when the new part of me, the part that got tired of being the easy option, spoke up so clearly that even I was surprised, and it said that the difference this time was not the size of the loss or the nastiness of the smirk. It was the fact that I had stopped asking for permission to be treated fairly, which is why, before I ever called any of them, I made a different call and described to someone whose job is not to protect family pride exactly what had happened, down to the time I noticed the laptop missing and the messages where he admitted selling it, and I followed instructions like an adult who expects to be taken seriously. When my parents slid into their routine about keeping outsiders out, I listened without interrupting. Then I told them I was not asking for permission or blessing or a family vote. And I was not bargaining over whether the theft counted as theft because the person I already spoke to had no trouble using that word, and for the first time in a long time there was a silence that did not feel like I was the one being put on trial. It felt like the floor had shifted under them because the usual lovers were not connected to anything anymore. Mark laughed, because that is what he does when he thinks I am bluffing, and he said I would not dare, that I always threaten and then cool off, that I will realize it is not worth the drama, and I told him I do not make threats, I make choices. And I had already made one that morning, which is why I was not asking him to give it back. I was telling him to prepare for a conversation that would not be happening in our parents' kitchen, and you could hear the air leave the room because this was the moment he finally understood that the line he has joked about crossing for years had an edge. You want the hook. So here it is in plain words that do not need decoration, because truth told simply hits harder than any ornament. My brother sold my laptop and bragged that our parents would make me drop it like always. And they tried their best out of habit and fear and the need to keep the image intact. But before I called them, I filed a report. I secured the messages, I noted the timeline, and I was ready to let this play out wherever it needed to go. Which means by the time they told me to calm down, the wheels were already turning, and none of them knew it yet. He told me to relax and take the cash he could scrape together, and my mother whispered that I should not ruin his life over a mistake, and my father suggested we could call the store and work something out privately, and I said we will absolutely work something out. Just not privately, and in the quiet that followed, my phone lit up with a call from a number I recognized immediately, which I let ring long enough for everyone to see the name, and when I answered and said yes, I am available to speak right now, Mark's smile finally cracked, because for the first time in his life he realized I had already moved the game to a place where his usual tricks do not work, and that is where I will leave it for now, because what happened next deserves its own moment. If there is one thing I have learned over the years about my family, it is that when a conflict breaks out, it is never really about the actual incident, no matter how clear the facts are or how much evidence you put on the table. It is always about the unwritten rule that the person who makes the least noise and bends the most is the one who gets assigned the burden of fixing it, which is why, almost from the second I hung up that first call, the pressure campaign began in a way that felt almost choreographed, as if everyone had agreed, without speaking, that their mission was not to hold Mark accountable but to convince me I was overreacting and that the only sane outcome was to let him skate free again. It started with the kind of messages that pretend to be caring but are really calculated to soften you up. My mother texting that she didn't sleep well because she was worried about the tension between her children. And my father suggesting that we meet for dinner, just to talk it through, which I have come to understand means we'll wear you down until you agree with us. When I didn't respond right away, the tone shifted almost seamlessly into guilt. My mother called and told me that Mark had been under enormous stress lately, that he was juggling bills and trying to keep his job, and that one bad decision shouldn't define him forever, as if the years of smaller, quieter thefts, manipulations, and convenient borrowing never happened, as if we were all just supposed to treat this like an isolated misstep made in the fog of desperation. Mark, for his part, leaned into the smug performance he has perfected over time. He dropped little comments into the family group chat about how some people can't take a joke or some people love making drama out of nothing, and he sprinkled in references to when this blows over like it was already a done deal. He even posted a picture of himself at a bar with friends, tagging it with a caption about celebrating freedom, which I'm sure was meant to signal that he wasn't worried, because he assumed, with the arrogance only someone who has never faced real consequences can have, that I would eventually cave like I always had. The conversations with my parents became more direct and, honestly, more exhausting. They told me, repeatedly, that involving the police was a nuclear option, and that once I went down that road, there was no going back, as though I hadn't already committed to it fully. They reminded me that family problems should stay within the family, that airing our dirty laundry would make everyone look bad, and that I was risking permanent damage to relationships I should value above any material possession. The thing is, they talked about it as if the real damage was me holding my ground, not Mark betraying my trust and stealing something that was mine. I decided in those moments that if they were going to try to corner me, I would need to be even more methodical than I had planned. I didn't argue every point they made because I knew that arguing just gave them more opportunities to twist my words. Instead, I started quietly building my case in a way that would make it impossible for them to dismiss as just sibling drama. I went through my messages with Mark and screenshotted every admission he'd made about selling the laptop. I contacted my bank to pull the purchase records for the laptop itself, showing it was bought by me, with my money in my name. I reached out to a friend who works in a local pawn shop to discreetly ask if any recent sales matched the description of my device, and when they confirmed that one had been sold to a second-hand electronics store in another part of town, I felt a grim kind of validation, not joy, not triumph, just the steady satisfaction of knowing I had hard facts on my side. Mark must have sensed I wasn't softening, because his tone shifted too. He called me late one night, sounding annoyed rather than conciliatory, and accused me of making things worse by not letting it drop. He said I was acting like I'd never made a mistake in my life and warned me that once you go legal with something, you can't take it back, and I should think about how much damage that could do to him. The funny thing was, it never once occurred to him to say, "I'm sorry," or "I'll fix this." It was all about me controlling the fallout for him, which told me everything I needed to know about where his head was. By this point, my parents had escalated to what I call the divide and isolate tactic, calling me separately in different tones to try to chip away at my resolve from different angles. My mother would lean on emotion, talking about how she couldn't bear to see her kids at odds, while my father would frame it like a business negotiation, offering to replace the laptop himself if I would just close the matter and move on. They didn't realize that I had already passed the point of being bought off, not because I needed revenge for its own sake, but because I knew that the moment I gave in, I'd be setting the precedent for every future interaction. Take what you want. Apologize just enough to make mom and dad think you're sorry, and wait for me to fold. Still, I kept my cards close. I didn't tell them the full scope of what I'd already done, or the fact that I'd been in touch with someone who had more than enough reason to take this seriously. I wanted the element of surprise to work in my favor, not just for the satisfaction of the reveal, but because I knew that if they saw it coming, they'd throw every possible obstacle in my way. And then, just as I was debating whether to finally tell them outright that I'd already involved law enforcement, my phone rang. The number wasn't Mark's. It wasn't my parents'. It was one I recognized from the day I first made that call, the day I decided I wasn't going to be the quiet, compliant sibling anymore. I stared at it for a few seconds, letting it ring, before answering in front of my parents, not because I needed an audience, but because I wanted them to hear my side of the conversation, to hear the calm in my voice when I confirmed details, to hear me say, "Yes, I have all the documentation ready," and to realize that I wasn't bluffing, I wasn't exaggerating, and I wasn't going to back down this time. When I hung up, they were both looking at me like I'd just stepped out of a role they'd written for me years ago, and they didn't know who I was anymore. Mark, who had walked into the room halfway through, tried to laugh it off, muttering that I was still playing games, but the edge in his voice gave him away. What he didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the game was already in motion, and the rules had changed in ways they weren't ready for. There is a particular kind of silence that happens in a family when you drop a fact so far outside of the normal script that it doesn't just interrupt the conversation, it breaks the rhythm they've been relying on for years. And that's exactly what I got when I finally decided to stop letting them circle around their favorite arguments about family loyalty and second chances, and instead said the one sentence that would make them realize I hadn't just been venting or bluffing. I had been acting. I told them, in the calmest tone I could manage, that I had already filed a police report, that the matter was no longer just between me and Mark, and that any decision about what happens next was now going to involve people whose job isn't to protect anyone's feelings. For a few seconds, no one reacted at all. My mother just stared at me, like she was waiting for the punchline, while my father leaned back, as if buying himself time to decide whether to scold me or try to reason with me. Mark was the first to speak, and of course, it wasn't anything close to an apology, it was an accusation, the kind of indignant deflection you only get from someone who has been told all his life that he's untouchable. He said I was trying to ruin his life over a laptop, that I was blowing things out of proportion, and that it was cruel to involve the police when we could have just worked it out. It was almost funny, in a dark way, because the idea of working it out had never meant making things right. It had always meant me taking the loss quietly so he could avoid consequences. I let him go on for a while, not because I cared about his excuses, but because I wanted him to hear himself. The longer he talked, the more obvious it became that he didn't see what he had done as theft, and why would he? In our family, as long as you could spin a good story, your actions were mistakes and misunderstandings. I finally interrupted and told him, point blank, that what he did wasn't borrowing, it wasn't some vague mix-up, it was theft, and that the officer who had called me earlier that day used that word without hesitation. I could see my mother wince when I said theft, like the very word was too harsh for polite company, but I wasn't about to sugarcoat it to make anyone comfortable. What I didn't tell them, at least not yet, was how far along things already were. By the time we were having that conversation, the police had already confirmed that my laptop had been sold to a second-hand electronics store that was cooperating fully. They had the sales record, the serial number, and even the security footage of Mark making the sale. The store manager had agreed to hold the laptop until the investigation determined what to do next, which meant my files, my work, and the years of data I thought I'd lost were now sitting in a back room with a tag on them, waiting to come home. Knowing that gave me a kind of steady, controlled energy. I didn't need to scream or plead, because the facts were already lined up like dominoes, and it was just a matter of when they would fall. My father tried a different approach then. He said, in his most reasonable voice, that a police report didn't have to lead to charges if I would just be willing to walk it back, and that it wasn't too late to reframe the situation so that Mark could return the money and replace the laptop without anything going on his record. The way he said it made it clear that his priority wasn't justice or fairness, it was optics. He didn't want the embarrassment of people outside the family knowing that one of his children had stolen from another, because in his mind, the worst thing you can be is a family with dirty laundry flapping in public. Mark, meanwhile, wasn't even trying to hide his anger anymore. He accused me of setting him up, of going nuclear, just to humiliate him, and when I told him I had proof of everything, he demanded to see it, as if my case would somehow fall apart if he could poke holes in it. I didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, I told him that the people who needed to see the proof already had it, and that whether or not he ever saw it himself didn't matter. That seemed to rattle him more than anything, because it was the first time in his life I'd refused to let him control the flow of information. It was my mother who broke the stalemate, but not in the way I think she intended. She said that if I really had involved the police, then I'd better be prepared for what that meant, because once the system was involved, they wouldn't care about family bonds or personal history. They would just look at the evidence and act. I don't think she realized she'd just made my point for me, because that was exactly why I'd gone to them in the first place. I didn't want family politics, guilt trips, or emotional manipulation determining whether or not I got my property back. I wanted a process where the only thing that mattered was what actually happened. By the time that conversation ended, I could feel the shift in the air. The confidence Mark had been wearing like armor was starting to crack. He didn't know the full scope of what was coming, but he understood now that I wasn't bluffing, and more importantly, that the safety net he'd always relied on, our parents stepping in to shield him, wasn't going to work this time. They were still trying, of course, but I could see in their faces that they were starting to wonder whether they could actually stop the process now that it had started. And that's when I decided that the next move wouldn't be about arguing or persuading anymore. The time for debating the morality of my decision was over. From here on out, it was about letting the facts, the evidence, and the consequences do the talking, and making sure that when they did, there would be no way for him to spin them into something they weren't. What none of them realized yet was that I had one more card to play, and it was going to make sure that even if they somehow found a way to smooth this over in the short term, I would still hold the leverage for as long as I needed it. But that, I decided, could wait until the right moment. If the first wave was guilt and the second wave was denial dressed up as negotiation, the third wave came in like a coordinated campaign. Because once Mark realized the usual routine wasn't going to make me fold, and once my parents realized that I wasn't playing the be the bigger person role anymore, they shifted into a mode that looked a lot like damage control mixed with amateur spin. And I could practically see the group text threads lighting up without me in them while they tried out new angles to see which one might pry open the door I had finally bolted shut from my side. Mark started with the easiest trick first, the one that has always worked on people who prefer harmony to facts. He tried to rewrite the story while it was still being written, which meant suddenly he remembered. that the laptop might have been his all along because he had contributed to something months back, and then, when I laughed, he pivoted into a claim that he had only sold it because he thought I said I was replacing it anyway, which I had not. And because he believed it was just sitting there, which it absolutely was not, and when that didn't land, he went for the fake witnesses, texting that a couple of his friends were ready to confirm they had heard me say it was fine. The problem for him was that I had the messages where he admitted selling it, I had the receipt with my name, and I now had a case number attached to the whole mess, so his sudden flood of creative memory wasn't just unconvincing, it was insulting. My parents, to their credit, switched tactics from pleading to practical in a way that would have fooled me a few years ago, because now the pitch wasn't drop it for family, it was be smart about this. Which is how my father described his offer to reimburse me personally so we could close the loop and avoid a permanent mark on Mark's record, and when I said that was generous but irrelevant, he tried a different door, asking for a timeline of what the police were doing and whether there was still a way to pause the report while we sorted things out, as if this were a streaming show he could stop and start when the episode made him uncomfortable. My mother, meanwhile, called to tell me Mark had been terrified since I said the word report and that he was finally realizing the seriousness, and then she asked, very softly, if I could show mercy because he has finally learned. And the part one didn't say out loud was that he only learns when the lesson has teeth. I knew that if I kept this on the level of family debate, I'd get dragged back into a swamp of feelings and speeches where the person with the calmest voice wins, so I kept doing what I had promised myself I would do from the start, which was to act like an adult speaking to systems that care about evidence, not performance. I kept my notes organized, I saved copies of every message, and I sent the additional serial number documentation the officer requested so the store could tag the device properly as disputed property pending resolution. When the manager of the second-hand store called me directly, polite and a little nervous, to say the laptop had been pulled from the floor and set aside, I thanked him, because the point wasn't to punish a store that cooperated. The point was to make sure that the thing that was mine would not be flipped again while my brother played victim in our parents' kitchen. The pushback took one more turn when Mark tried to get ahead of the story with people outside the family, which he has never had to do before because usually I do the one thing that makes his life easier, which is keep quiet. This time I did not. Which is how a colleague of his ended up calling me from a number I didn't have, asking if everything was okay because Mark had mentioned a misunderstanding with his sister over a device, and I don't know exactly what he expected me to say, maybe something vague that would let him keep his halo on at work, but what I said, as calmly as I could, was that there was a police report, that there were records, and that I was not discussing details with anyone who didn't need them. And I ended that call thinking I would let the chips fall where they may. I will not pretend I didn't take one small extra step that afternoon, a step that some people will call petty and others will call fair play, which was to send an anonymous note through a company tip line page that is publicly available, attaching no files, naming no names, simply stating that an employee in Mark's department had sold property that did not belong to him and that there was an active case number if anyone in HR needed to verify the integrity risk. I didn't do it to ruin his life. I did it to ensure that for once the environment around him mirrored reality instead of cushioning it. By the time the officer called me again, I was almost numb from the whiplash of being tugged between family loyalty theater and actual accountability. And hearing that measured voice ask if I could come by to finalize my supplemental statement and that they had a time scheduled to bring Mark in for an interview did not make me gleeful, it made me steady, which is an emotion I haven't felt in a long time around this person. I told the officer I would be there. I asked whether I needed to notify anyone myself, and I was told no, they had it handled, which in a quiet way was the most satisfying sentence of the week. You would think that would be the moment when my parents realized the only sensible move was to get out of the way and let the process work, but habit is a strong thing, and instead my father tried one last negotiation, saying he had spoken to a lawyer friend who recommended a private agreement where Mark would reimburse me, replace the laptop, and sign a letter acknowledging responsibility in exchange for me withdrawing the report. And for the first time I didn't immediately reject it, not because I wanted to save face for anyone, but because I was already constructing something cleaner in my head, something that would not just patch this single crisis, but would give me real leverage if he ever tried a stunt like this again. So I told my father I would consider a private resolution, but only if it included proof of replacement, full repayment now rather than someday, a notarized admission that could be used if he ever violated the terms, and a clause that allowed me to reinstate the complaint if he breached, and I asked him to pass that to his lawyer friend to translate into adult paperwork rather than family promises. I didn't say it with spite, I said it like a project manager setting scope. And that shift in tone made them both stop trying to persuade me and start realizing I was laying a track they might actually have to follow. Mark, on the other hand, heard paperwork and lost his cool, which is how we ended that night with him yelling that I was blackmailing him in my own living room while my mother cried and my father paced. And I let them have their scene because I knew something they did not know yet, which is that the timeline was no longer theirs to stretch or shrink, and that in the morning a call would arrive with specifics that would take all the air out of their improvisation. When that call came, I answered on speaker, and the officer very professionally confirmed the date and time Mark needed to appear for questioning, read the standard explanation about rights and cooperation, and asked if anyone had questions. And for the first time since this started, my brother had nothing to say. I wish I could tell you that this was the end of it, that he immediately agreed to my terms, and we all signed and moved forward like adults, but if this were easy it would not be my family. And what came next required a decision that would either end the pattern forever or drag me back into it, which is why, when I hung up, I told Mark and my parents there was one way to settle it quickly and there was another way to settle it thoroughly, and that I had already chosen, and I watched their faces as they realized I wasn't bluffing about the thorough way at all. By the time the day arrived for his interview, I had already run through every version of the conversation in my head, from the one where he doubled down and tried to perform innocence right there at the station, to the one where he broke down and begged me to fix what he had broken, and because I know my family and their appetite for last-minute saves, I decided I would not walk in with anger or with a speech. I would walk in with a solution that removed the guesswork and the tug-of-war and the endless loop of arguments about loyalty, and I would make it so clean that even people addicted to drama would have to accept the terms precisely because there would be nothing left to argue about once they signed. An hour before he was due to show up, I asked him to meet me at a small office near the courthouse where a notary worked out of a room that smelled like toner and coffee. And he came in twitchy and defensive with our parents hovering like they were there to supervise a hostage exchange, and I told them, without raising my voice and without gloating, that what I had in my bag were 3 documents, and that if he signed them and did one more thing immediately after, I would walk to the precinct and file a written request to withdraw my complaint as a cooperative victim before his interview began, and that if he refused, I would say nothing more at all and let the process continue without me interfering. The first document was simple and short on purpose, a sworn admission that he had taken and sold my property without consent, that he had received money for it, and that the device, serial number included, belonged to me and would be returned or replaced at his cost. The second document was the payment agreement with no wiggle room. Full repayment that day by cashier's check for the sale amount plus the cost of a new replacement model recorded on the spot with a receipt and no promises of paying me back later when some imaginary windfall arrived. The third document was the one that finally made my father stop pacing because it was a civil confession of judgment prepared by a lawyer acquaintance who had explained it to me in plain language, meaning that if he failed to follow the terms at any point, I could enter that confession in court without another round of litigation and enforce it like a judgment, and attached to it was a clause that said the withdrawal of the criminal complaint did not preclude reinstatement should he breach, with my notarized statement and the existing evidence preserved for that exact purpose. He argued about the words for a while, picking at lines like a teenager trying to renegotiate a curfew, and my mother tried to make it about forgiveness again, but I kept bringing it back to the same point, which was that if he really meant the few weak apologies he had managed to mutter when the consequences finally showed up at his door, then this was the fastest and only way to prove it. Because talk was what had kept him comfortable all these years and paper was what would finally make him accountable when the moment passed and the excuses came back to life. When he saw the cashier's check requirement, he said he didn't have that kind of money available in one shot, and I told him I knew that. Which was why his car title would be held as collateral until the balance was paid that afternoon by transferring funds from the account he used for the sale, and by borrowing from the same friends he had been posting drinks with 2 nights earlier. And I said it in the same tone you use when you remind someone of something basic, like where they left their keys, because I had spent enough of my life reacting to his chaos, and I had no interest in acting shocked that the chaos existed. He asked what the one more thing was, and I said it was the only part that wasn't about money or signatures, and it was the part that would shift the house rules forever. Which was a recorded apology delivered on the family group chat where he would say in his own words that he stole from me, that he lied about it, that our parents had pressured me to drop it, and that it was wrong. And that from that day forward, any time he needed help he would not go through them, he would come to me like an adult and accept no for an answer if that is what I gave, because the record needed to exist in the one place where the rewriting always happened, and the only way to stop the gaslighting is to put the truth where they usually store the myths. He cursed under his breath, my mother started to cry again, my father asked if we could remove the recorder part because it felt punitive, and I said the recorder part was the price for me owning my dignity inside this family. And that if they wanted a future where I sat at the same table without anger burning a hole through my stomach, then we were going to acknowledge what had happened in the same room where everyone usually pretends it never did. And that was the only concession I was even remotely interested in because everything else was non-negotiable. It could have gone either way, and I am not going to pretend I was certain, but there is a moment when a person who has lived without consequences stares down the first real one and realizes the elevator only goes down from here. And I watched that moment arrive on his face, which is how we ended up at the bank next door getting the cashier's check, at the electronics store picking up the tagged laptop with the manager's careful nod, back at the notary's desk signing the papers one by one. And finally in the parking lot while he recorded the apology with my phone held steady, and I kept my eyes on the time because I was going to keep my word to the officer whether my brother followed through or not, and he knew that. Which is why he did not stall anymore once he saw I was not bluffing about deadlines. I walked to the precinct with the documents clipped together and told the officer I was withdrawing as complainant based on full restitution and a signed civil confession that preserved my rights if he breached, and the officer, who had been professional and patient the whole way, told me that while they respected my decision, the file would not evaporate and the notes would remain, and I said that was exactly what I wanted because certainty, not war, was the point. And for the first time since this started, I felt the tightness leave my chest, not because I had won a fight, but because I had ended a pattern. Back home, the group chat sat there with his apology on top like a pinned reality, and no one typed anything for a long time, which was merciful, and later my mother sent me a private message asking if I was happy now. And I told her happiness had nothing to do with it, that what I felt was relief, the kind that comes when you stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from confusion, and I told her I would be around. But I would not be available for conversations that treat accountability like cruelty, and she said she understood even though I know she did not, and that is fine, because understanding is not a condition for me to live like an adult in my own life. I replaced my laptop, I restored the backups I had almost given up on, I filed the signed documents and scanned them into a folder with a name that will remind me why I did this if I ever start to doubt myself, and I put the case notes, the photos, and the serial number proof in a sealed envelope in my desk with a sticky note that says what to do if the line is crossed again, which I hope I never need, but which will keep me from second-guessing myself if I do, because the lesson here is not that I needed to punish him forever, it is that I needed to make sure the next time someone says drop it like always, the answer will already be written. People keep asking if I think I went too far, and I tell them that depends on whether you think the point of family is to protect the person who causes the harm or the person who refuses to carry it anymore, and that if you know the difference, then you already know why I did it this way, and why, when the dust settled and the signatures were dry and the apology sat there in plain view, I finally felt something I had never felt after any of our old fights, which was simple and quiet and complete. Not revenge for revenge's sake, not petty satisfaction, just the knowledge that I had finally turned the table the right way up and left it that way, and that if he ever tries to flip it again, I will not have to start from zero. Because the last move has already been made and it was mine.